Donald Trump is scrambling, and the reason is a $37 million port deal in Halifax, Nova Scotia. $37 million in a trade war measured in hundreds of billions, in an economic confrontation that has already involved energy cutoffs, diplomatic severance, and defense realignments worth nearly €500 billion. The single thing that just sent the White House into a genuine operational panic is a port modernization deal that costs less than a single F-35 fighter jet, less than what some American cities spend annually on road maintenance, less than the catering budget for a mid-sized military exercise. And if you're wondering how $37 million could possibly matter at this scale, how a port upgrade in a mid-sized Canadian Atlantic city could send the most powerful nation on Earth into crisis mode, that is exactly the right question. Because the answer is the most important thing that has happened in this entire trade war. Nobody saw it coming, and that invisibility was not an accident. American East Coast ports are now projected to lose upward of $40 billion in annual shipping revenue over the next decade. 14 major global shipping lines have announced route optimizations through Halifax. Customs facilitation agreements with 19 nations were signed alongside the deal. A European-Asian trade corridor that bypasses the United States entirely has been constructed and is already operational. Every port, every customs office, every square inch of American jurisdiction has been architecturally circumvented for $37 million. Warren Buffett called it the greatest leverage play he has seen in his career. $37 million, he said, is what it cost to redirect the trade architecture of the North Atlantic. Most people spend more than that on a building. Carney spent it on a choke point. And the line now being repeated in every trade ministry in the Western world, the line that logistics executives and port authorities and shipping strategists are calling the most concise explanation of strategic genius they have ever heard, is what Carney said when reporters asked why the Halifax deal had been kept so quiet. 6 words, delivered with a half smile, in the calm of a man who finished the game 3 moves ago. Big doors swing on small hinges. The deal looks completely unremarkable on paper, and that unremarkableness was entirely deliberate. The announced deal was $37 million Canadian dollars in port infrastructure upgrades at the Port of Halifax, terminal modernization, a new digital logistics management system, expanded refrigerated storage capacity, upgraded container handling cranes and gantry systems, and deep water berth improvements to accommodate the latest generation of ultra-large container vessels. It was announced quietly in a routine federal infrastructure funding press release, bundled with 43 other transportation and port investments across the country. It received 4 paragraphs in the Halifax Chronicle-Herald, 2 sentences in the Globe and Mail, 0 international coverage, 0 diplomatic cables, 0 White House briefings. It didn't appear on any American trade monitoring report, any intelligence assessment, or any congressional briefing document. By every measure, it was exactly what it appeared to be: a modest infrastructure maintenance investment in a regional Canadian port. And that was the design. The deal was structured to be boring, routine, and invisible, because in trade strategy, invisible is a weapon. Nobody monitors invisible. Nobody flags invisible for review. Nobody briefs the president on invisible. By the time invisible reveals itself as strategic, it's already done. The first hint that something was different came 3 weeks later, when a shipping industry analyst in Singapore noticed that the Halifax deal's annexes included references to international logistics facilitation partnerships and preferential berth allocation frameworks, language that had never appeared in routine Canadian port infrastructure spending. She flagged it in a subscriber newsletter. Nobody picked it up. It took another 6 weeks before the full picture emerged, because attached to that $37 million infrastructure deal, embedded in the annexes and memorandums of understanding signed on the same day in the same offices by the same officials, was something else entirely. Signed alongside the port upgrade were preferential shipping agreements with 19 nations, including Germany, France, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, South Korea, Japan, India, Singapore, Australia, and 10 additional trading economies spanning 3 continents. Preferential means guaranteed berth priority at Halifax terminals. Partner nations' vessels dock first, load first, depart first. It means expedited customs processing, with cargo from partner nations clearing Halifax customs in under 4 hours through pre-clearance digital systems, compared to the 36 to 72 hours typical at major American East Coast ports. It means reduced port fees, a fee structure calibrated to be 15 to 25% below equivalent American port costs, creating a price advantage stacked on top of the speed advantage. It means dedicated terminal access, with specific berths and container yards allocated exclusively to partner nation shipping lines during peak periods, guaranteeing capacity that American ports simply cannot match because American ports allocate on a first-come basis, subject to congestion that has been worsening for years. Alongside the shipping agreements sat customs facilitation treaties with every signatory nation, establishing mutual digital pre-clearance where cargo manifests are submitted electronically, duties calculated in advance, and regulatory compliance verified before the ship even leaves its origin port, so that when vessels arrive in Halifax, the cargo moves from ship to rail in hours rather than sitting on a dock for days waiting for inspections and paperwork. Alongside those customs treaties were bonded transit arrangements, allowing goods moving through Halifax to third-party destinations to transit without duties, inspections, or delays, transforming Halifax from a destination port into a through port, a logistics hub where goods arrive from one continent and depart for another without ever entering Canadian domestic commerce and without ever touching American jurisdiction. And beneath all of it was the $37 million digital logistics platform. Blockchain-verified cargo tracking, AI-optimized berth scheduling, real-time customs integration with every partner nation's trade systems, creating a technological infrastructure so advanced that switching to it from legacy port systems is an upgrade for every shipping line that uses it, and switching away from it once adopted is an operational downgrade no logistics director would accept. What Halifax becomes is not a Canadian port with some international agreements. It becomes the primary North Atlantic logistics hub for a European-Asian trade corridor that routes around the United States entirely. Goods from Asia, electronics from South Korea, manufactured products from Japan, textiles and components from India and Southeast Asia arrive at Pacific Canadian ports in Vancouver and Prince Rupert, which had already been quietly upgraded with complementary infrastructure investments over the preceding 18 months. Those goods then transit by Canadian National and Canadian Pacific Rail across the Canadian continent. 3,700 miles of rail corridor entirely within Canadian sovereign territory. They arrive at Halifax and depart for European markets on vessels operating under the preferential agreements, with customs already cleared, duties already calculated, and documentation already verified. Door to door, Shanghai to Rotterdam, through the Halifax corridor. Faster than routing through any American port, cheaper by an estimated 11 to 18%, and critically, entirely free from American tariff structures, American regulatory uncertainty, American customs delays, and American political risk. The reverse flow operates identically. A complete bi-directional transcontinental trade corridor built on Canadian soil, running on Canadian rail, flowing through Canadian ports, governed by Canadian trade agreements, untouched by American tariffs, unreachable by American regulations, and immune to American political risk. Commerce doesn't have loyalty. Commerce has math, and the math now points to Halifax. Trade analysts estimate the corridor could capture between 140 and 200 billion in annual shipping volume within 5 years. Volume that currently flows through American East Coast ports, New York and New Jersey, Savannah, Norfolk, Charleston, and Baltimore. Every major American Atlantic port is projected to lose volume to a corridor that offers superior speed, lower cost, less risk, and preferential customs treatment. And the economics are self-reinforcing. The more volume flows through Halifax, the more shipping lines optimize their routes around it. The more routes are optimized, the more port infrastructure expands to accommodate demand. The more infrastructure expands, the more partner nations deepen their integration. Network effects in logistics are nearly impossible to reverse once they reach critical mass, because every participant in the network benefits from every other participant, and leaving the network means losing those benefits. The $37 million was the seed. The trade agreements were the roots. The corridor is the tree. And the tree, once it reaches canopy, blocks the sunlight for everything beneath it. The answer to how nobody saw this coming is misdirection. Not the dramatic kind involving deception or disinformation, but the structural kind that is far more effective. While every headline, every briefing, every congressional hearing, every White House war room session focused on the big, visible moves, the energy suspension, the diplomatic severance, the defense realignment, the Arctic sovereignty accord, Carney was quietly building the physical infrastructure of a post-American trade network through a series of modest, routine-looking investments that never triggered strategic review. Small port capacity upgrades at Prince Rupert and Vancouver, rail modernization investments along the transcontinental corridor, digital customs integration systems tested and deployed at multiple border points, each one individually unremarkable, each one announced in routine budget documents, each one invisible to American monitoring systems designed to flag large, sudden, strategically significant moves. Together, the components of a continent-spanning trade corridor assembled in plain sight over 18 months while Washington was consumed by the crisis it could see. The Halifax customs treaties were finalized while Washington was consumed with the energy suspension fallout. The Pacific port upgrades were signed during the Defense Compact negotiations in Brussels. The rail capacity expansions were announced during the Greenland confrontation. Every headline crisis was real, but every headline crisis was also a smokescreen. The big moves were genuine, and they were also cover for the small move that will outlast all of them. The tariffs will eventually end. The diplomatic severance will eventually be resolved. The energy flows will eventually resume in some form. The Halifax trade corridor is permanent because infrastructure doesn't negotiate, it endures. And the geography behind it is the one competitive advantage that cannot be replicated, cannot be purchased, and cannot be legislated away. Halifax is the closest major deep water port in North America to Northern Europe. Ships departing Halifax reach Rotterdam, Hamburg, Antwerp, and London 2 to 3 days faster than ships from New York, 4 days faster than from Savannah, and nearly a full week faster than from Gulf Coast ports. Halifax Harbour is one of the deepest natural harbours in the world, 16 metres at low tide in the main channel, capable of handling the largest container vessels and bulk carriers afloat without the dredging, tidal restrictions, and draft limitations that constrain most American East Coast ports. It operates ice-free year-round, connects directly to the Canadian Transcontinental Rail Network, and sits at the mouth of the North Atlantic shipping corridor, the busiest trade lane on Earth, meaning every vessel moving between Europe and Eastern North America passes within operational range. Warren Buffett's response to the Halifax deal began with a number. $37 million, he said. In 70 years of business, he had never seen a more asymmetric move. $37 million to lock the most powerful nation on Earth out of the North Atlantic trade corridor. He drew a distinction that cut straight to the heart of what happened. There are two kinds of people in business: dealers and investors. A dealer watches the price. How much does this cost? How much can I charge? What's the spread? A dealer lives in the transaction. An investor watches the position. Where does this sit on the board? What does it connect to? What does it unlock? Trump is a dealer. He watches prices, tariff rates, trade deficits, the big visible numbers that make headlines and fill press conferences. Carney is an investor. He looked at a mid-sized Canadian Atlantic port and saw what nobody in Washington saw, that Halifax, upgraded with the right infrastructure and connected to the right agreements, wasn't a port. It was a choke point. And a choke point, once activated, is worth more than the entire economy that flows through it, because the economy cannot function without it. The best move in business, Buffett added, is the one your competitor finds out about after it's already finished, not during. After. When the contracts are signed, the infrastructure is built, and the partners are locked in. By the time anyone realized the port upgrade was the anchor of a trade corridor worth $150 billion a year in volume, the corridor was already operational. It was finished. When Washington finally grasped the full scope of the Halifax deal, it was not from intelligence briefings, not from trade monitoring systems, not from diplomatic channels, but from a Financial Times investigation published 11 weeks after the agreements were signed. Senior trade officials reportedly read the article, requested the underlying documents, and discovered that the annexes, the customs treaties, the preferential agreements, and the bonded transit arrangements had been publicly filed in Canadian federal databases for months. The information was never classified. It was never hidden. It was simply unread. The scrambled responses came in rapid succession, and each one arrived too late. Emergency calls to major shipping lines requesting commitments to maintain volume at American ports were met with polite deferrals. The lines had already signed optimization agreements with Halifax that offered better terms, faster processing, and contractual penalties for withdrawal. A hastily proposed $2 billion emergency port modernization package was criticized within hours as inadequate and requiring 3 to 5 years of construction that Halifax didn't need because the upgrades were already complete. Diplomatic outreach to signatory nations urging them to withdraw from the preferential agreements was rebuffed across the board. Every signatory nation's trade ministry delivered the same essential message. The agreements are commercially advantageous, our exporters benefit, and we have no incentive to abandon a functioning system because the United States failed to build one. Every proposed response suffered from the same fundamental problem. The corridor was operational now. Washington was proposing solutions to a problem that had already been solved by someone else 18 months earlier for $37 million. At a press conference in Ottawa, when a reporter raised the Halifax deal and its consequences for American ports, the room expected a dramatic geopolitical declaration. Instead, Carney talked about the port workers in Halifax, the engineers who designed the digital logistics platform, the customs professionals who negotiated the facilitation treaties, the rail operators who coordinated the transcontinental scheduling. He framed it not as a geopolitical masterstroke, but as Canadian competence. People doing their jobs well, building systems that work, investing in infrastructure that serves the country. The modesty of his tone mirrored the modesty of the deal itself. When a reporter pressed him, critics in Washington say this deal was specifically designed to lock the United States out of the North Atlantic trade corridor, was it? Carney paused. The room waited, and then he smiled. Not a grin, not a smirk. Something smaller and more private. The expression of someone who has just been asked to explain something they find genuinely amusing. Big doors swing on small hinges. The room went quiet for a beat, and then the murmur began. Within an hour, the phrase was trending. Within a day, it was on the front pages of the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, and Reuters simultaneously. Within a week, it had been quoted in 11 parliamentary proceedings, 4 central bank speeches, and an uncountable number of business school lectures. He followed it with a sentence that completed the thought: "We didn't build a trade corridor. We upgraded a port. The trade corridor built itself, because when you create the right conditions, commerce finds the shortest path. It always does. That's not strategy. That's gravity." Trump imposed tariffs worth hundreds of billions to prove American economic dominance. Carney spent $37 million to root around it. The tariffs made headlines. The port deal made history. And the most powerful economy on earth just discovered that power doesn't matter when someone else controls the door, and that the door can be built, locked, and operational before you even know it exists. If a $37 million port deal could build a trade corridor worth $150 billion a year in volume, if a move this small could lock the United States out of the North Atlantic, the question that should unsettle Washington more than anything else is simply this: what else has been built while nobody was watching? What other small deals, routine investments, and quiet infrastructure upgrades have been put in place across Canadian ports, rail networks, digital systems, and trade partnerships that haven't surfaced yet? If this is what was found, what hasn't been found? And if the monitoring systems, the intelligence frameworks, and the strategic planning apparatus of the most powerful nation in the history of the world can be bypassed by a port upgrade and a stack of customs treaties, then what exactly is all that power protecting? 6 words answered it for strategists, investors, and trade ministers who will study them for the next generation. 6 words that explained how a $37 million port upgrade in Nova Scotia locked the most powerful nation on Earth out of the North Atlantic trade corridor. 6 words that captured the principle behind every quiet move that changed the world while nobody was watching. Big doors swing on small hinges.